Okay, well, I think we'll make a start. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this edition of Wadham in the World, which is a series in which we're going to be looking at a very broad range of issues, questions, topics. And we're particularly delighted that we're starting the first one with one of our honorary fellows. In fact, one of our two new honorary fellows, Paul Goodwin. Thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening, Paul. But Paul is going to be in conversation for 30 minutes or so with Professor Jane Garnett, who's a tutorial fellow in modern history at Wadham. And I'm going to introduce them briefly before handing over to Jane. Once their conversation is finished, you'll be able to ask questions for half an hour or so. So we've got plenty of time for questions. You can either ask questions by putting them in the chat function, or if you prefer, you can raise your hand by clicking on the participants button and finding the little yellow hand, and we'll take questions both from the chat function and from people raising their hands after Jane and Paul's conversation is concluded. Paul Goodwin is a curator, researcher, educator, and urban theorist based in London. His curatorial research and writing projects extend across the interdisciplinary fields of contemporary art, migration, urbanism, and curatorial studies with a focus on African diaspora art and visual cultures. He's currently Professor of Contemporary Art and Urbanism at the University of the Arts, London, and Director of the Research Centre for Transnational Art, Identity and Nation. Paul is perhaps best known for his important contributions to telling and showing the untold stories of the innovations of Black British artists who've been underrepresented in the history of British art via exhibitions and cultural projects at major museums such as Tate. His various exhibitions are too numerous to mention, but if you're interested to learn more about them, do Google Paul's name, and an enormous wealth of intellectual activity will be revealed to you. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, Paul. Professor Jane Garnett, as I've said, is a professor of modern history here in Oxford and a tutorial fellow at Wadham College. Her research is on intellectual, cultural, and religious history, predominantly since the 19th century, including the study of gender and visual culture over wider periods. She's written extensively on debates about economic ethics, on the history of economic thought, on Christian moral and social philosophy, and on the relationship between art and social criticism. Thank you very much indeed, Jane, for taking part in this event this evening. And with that, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be involved, and it's lovely to welcome Paul. Obviously, we're welcoming him to virtual space, but we can all imagine we're in Wadham. Some of us are in Wadham. So, Paul, when we first met in the early 1990s, when you were at Wadham, we talked a lot about the issue of activism in the academy, which I guess frames tonight's conversation. And you were then working in the field of urbanism, particularly urban space, focusing on the banlieue of Paris. And I remember you talking a lot really about the challenges that many of the people you were studying saw you as a sort of black man from Oxford University, as somebody who would advocate for them directly, somebody who had power to do that sort of advocacy. And obviously, however sympathetic you were, that couldn't be directly your role. And I wondered whether your apparent, and perhaps more apparent than real, change of direction to art curation partly derived from thinking about that dilemma, in a way, the tensions of how best to act.
Sure. Well, firstly, thank you so much, Ken, for that very warm welcome. And I just wanted to say that I am thrilled and honoured to be elected as an honorary fellow of Wadham. And I've got a lot of great memories of Wadham and of Oxford, spending many years in Oxford. I've got many friends from Oxford. And And so I just wanted to say that initially, to say thank you very much, and to say I'm very proud and happy with that. And also thrilled to be in conversation with Jane, who I've known for a number of years, quite a long time, since I was in Oxford, and we've maintained a conversation. So to answer your question, Jane, yes, I think the kind of burden of representation that many Black intellectuals, artists, writers, curators have when working in mainstream institutions, and then perhaps doing research or working on subjects that are in communities that are often vulnerable or marginalized, there can be tensions that arise from that. And there are often expectations that if you're in a position of power, you will use the institution, or you will use that power in order to help the situation. And indeed, I have, when possible, and when I'm able to, I've tried to, utilize some of the positions that I've been into in various institutions to try and address some of the concerns that these communities are facing. So, for example, as you mentioned, I started off in the field of urbanism, thinking about the urban situation in Paris, and I've been long working on the situation in Paris, where many populations, Muslim populations, immigrant populations, African, Arab populations, were living in the banlieue, but also in the city, in very poor conditions. And so, as someone coming as a researcher from Oxford University, people were kind of quite intrigued as to what my position was and how I could help, or maybe often quite suspicious about my motivations for doing this kind of research, and how often asking me, well, how will it help us? How will research help us? And to be fair, Jane, it was a very good, very fair question. And I had to be, I've gone through a lot of thinking over the years about this. I mean, initially I just assumed that people would understand the relevance of academic research to everyday life, but that's quite a naive understanding, actually. And the years that I've spent in the academy and in art schools, I realized that it's much more complicated than that. And I think thinking about the current situation that we're all in at the moment, where we've seen the kind of attacks on knowledge, the attacks on experts, the downgrading of academic understandings in popular media, I think that position becomes even more under question. But to answer your question about, did that play a role in my turn towards art and curation? I think yes. I think it did, to the extent that I felt that I could working with in cultural production, which essentially is what exhibition making is that it can reach a wider audience. You can academic research, which I still engage in. I publish and work within an academic context, but let's be honest, most academic research is really read by the community of academic researchers, which in a social context is quite limited. But exhibitions are often seen by thousands of people, and they can tour. So some of the exhibitions I worked on, for example, at Tate, have been seen by large numbers of people and have caused quite big debates, and there've been lots of newspaper articles, etc., around that. So it has a wider discussion. So the answer to your question, I think yes, it was a factor in my decision to move into cultural production.
And tell us a bit about, I mean, obviously you had a wonderful remit at Tate in a way, to go delving and to, in a sense, reinvent the curatorial policy. Tell us a bit about what your approach was.
Sure. Well, at this point, maybe I'll share my screen so you can see some images. Can everyone see that? Yeah, can you see that, Jane?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, it's all visible. We can see it.
Wonderful. So, I guess I just wanted to show some works by artists that I've worked with and that I'm closely associated with. One of them is Sonia Boyce, who is a British artist of Caribbean origin, and these are some works that she's very well known for. She was the youngest artist, black or white, male or female, to be collected by Tate in the 1980s when she had works collected in the Tate collection. And she was also very prominent in the growth of the Black British art movement, which was a group of young Black British artists who were born in the UK, went to art school, and found that their concerns around representing the Black image in art was really at that time in a way neglected or not really, wasn't really part of their education. So they really wanted to make works that put the Black image and often themselves in the frame. And Sonia now is a professor. We were, in fact, Sonia is a colleague of mine at University of the Arts London, and we were jointly appointed as professors in 2013 together. She's also is the first Black woman to be elected as a Royal Academician from the Royal Academy in 2016, and she'll be representing Britain, the first Black female artist to represent Britain at the Venice Biennale next year. Shyla Berman is a very important British Asian artist and a very good friend of mine. I've worked with her on many different projects and exhibitions. And again, her work, she came from Leeds. She was from Liverpool, sorry, born in Liverpool. She calls herself a Punjabi Liverpudlian. And a lot of her works were, at that time, were about representing the image of the Asian female and putting it in the center of the frame. And again, her work now, that time was really, in a way, neglected by galleries. Now, her commission for the 2020 at the Tate Britain, Remembering a Brave New World, is a beautiful commission where she kind of celebrates Diwali in a way, but within that, there are lots of subversive symbols and ideas going on. This is the facade of Tate Britain, which is just across the road from Chelsea College of Arts, where I'm based. And Lubaina Himid is another very well-known artist that I've worked with quite a lot. A lot of her work, again, is about trying to bring Black women in particular into the frame of British art. And she's also a professor at University of Central Lancashire. And she received the 2017 Turner Prize. You can see her getting the prize here from Maria Balshaw, the director of Tate, in 2017. So the reason why I've just showed those images is because these are some of the artists and some of the concerns that I've been addressing in my work, which is to kind of really bring these artists, to help to bring these artists into national attention. And Jane, feel free to kind of come in at any point as I kind of go through some of these images. So this is Tate Britain. I mean,
you were saying that, of course, that these artists were really, when you actually got to Tate, all the Black and Asian British art was actually in the basement in the stores.
Yes, indeed. When I first joined Tate, you normally get an induction where you go to look at the Tate stores. And the Tate stores, if anyone has ever been to the Tate stores, and they soon will be accessible to the public, are actually incredible, because Tate has about 77,000 objects, and about 30,000 of those objects are from one artist, which is Turner. But only at any one time, about 12% of the collection is on display. So that means the vast majority of artworks are actually underground in these bunkers, in a way. And when I went to have a look, it's incredible. Some of the treasures you see there. I saw works of many, many famous artists, but also works that are never really seen at Tate, including the work of many Black artists, or some Black artists. And so it made me think, visiting those Tate stores, which are underground, vast repositories of work. Well, what determines for these works to be shown? Why are some works shown and not others? And this is obviously a long-going debate within the art field, and it often revolves around the personal tastes of curators. It often depends on the trends that are in art at that time. But there's a really important question in Tate Britain, because Tate Britain is the national collection of British art. So it's meant to represent, if you like, Britain in all its factions. And one of the factions of Britain which hasn't been very well represented until recently is the work of Black and Asian artists. And that's one of the things that I really tried to address in my work. And so I kind of developed what I called mantras of a recalcitrant curator. which meant just kind of, I gleaned some quotes and ideas from writers and philosophers that have helped me to kind of think through my time at Tate. One of them being the Jamaican sociologist and ex Rhodes Scholar at Merton College, Stuart Hall, who said, when you go through the door of ambivalent mainstreaming, it's a dangerous territory. It's an incredibly tricky territory, and all sorts of monsters are waiting on the other side to assimilate you up. And he was really talking about what we were talking about before, Jane, which is that, if you come from a marginal background and you come into a mainstream situation or mainstream institution, the danger is that you can be kind of assimilated up and just turned into a neutral person that is not able to advocate or to politically intervene. So that was something that really made me think a lot. And the other one that I think about is Marinetti's kind of idea of museums as cemeteries, which is part of the Futurist Manifesto. And that's pretty controversial because, of course, the Futurist Manifesto is one of the cultural artifacts of fascism. And of course, I reject the vast majority of fascist ideas in art. But the idea that museums, he believed that under modernism, the idea of museums, traditional museums, were that artworks went there to die because they were not really seen, and it takes art away from the people. And there was something that really resonated with me about that. And I felt that, and particularly with Black and other migrant communities, those works were really kind of not really seen. And so in a way, museums are like mausoleums in some respects.
Could I just chip in there, Paul?
Please do.
Obviously, one of the challenges of which in a way came out of the debates in Black British art in the 1980s was the question of how you situate Black British art within a broader art practice, as it were. And obviously there were controversies about the degree to which Black British art should be sort of separated out into a category of its own, or whether it should be shown, as part of a, either a modernist narrative or some other sort of narrative. And I was thinking, Stuart Hall, of course, also said that, Black has never just been there. It's always been unstable. It's a narrative, it's a story, it's history, it's something constructed, not simply found. And of course, that's true of white as well as Black. But I wondered to what extent, over the time you've been working as a curator, that sort of political tension, how you've responded to that, because it's a real live issue, isn't it?
Absolutely, Jane, and it's a key issue. And I think I've kind of responded it by taking my cue from artists and how artists have dealt with it. So for example, here you can see a work by the British artist Chris O'Feely, who this work actually was from an exhibition at Tate Britain in 2010, a survey. But it dates from a work that he made for the Venice Biennale for the British Pavilion. And so what he did, if you look there, this is on top of Tate Britain, okay? This is the flag that is over Tate Britain. And he basically uses the British flag and he turns them, he changes the colors of the British flag to signify the kind of Black nationalist colors of red, gold, and green. And what he's doing really is saying that Blackness and Britishness are not separate things, that the Black presence has always been part, or been part for many, many years, part of the British story. And so having it flying over Tate Britain replaced, and this is the first time, by the way, in the 200-year history of Tate Britain, that the Union Jack was actually replaced by the Union Black there. So, and that was a project that I oversaw. And at the same time, there was a kind of protest by the EDL, who were upset about a lot of things. And they weren't very happy when they saw that flag. And that's something that I was very proud of, actually, to kind of, to show a different understanding of art and how art relates to nation. This is Thin Black Lines, an exhibition I curated with Lubaina Himid, which was the first exhibition in Tate Britain's history to actually show work by Black women artists, Black and Asian women artists. This is a work by Shitaba Biswas called Housewives with Steak Knives, drawing on popular culture as well as Indian mythology, the goddess Kali, and as a kind of an avenger of colonialism. Some of the works this was made in the 1980s when a lot of these artists were at art school and were quite angry and were politically charged were challenging what they felt were the exclusions of racism. But other works, such as Sonia Boyce's work here, dealt with family issues. This one's called Mr. Close Friend of the Family Pays a Visit While Everyone Else is Out, which alluded to the domestic situation in families and the question of abuse, which again was a kind of a taboo subject in many communities. This is Claudette Johnson's female trilogy. And here, this was really kind of referencing her work, her style of painting references Picasso and modernism. As a result of this show, I think, in fact, most of the artists from this show are now in the Tate collection, including Claudette Johnson. So that's one thing I was really proud of. And please, Jane, whenever you want, just
mention this exhibition, then I'm going to ask you another question.
Yes. So Migration is another exhibition that I co-curated with a team of curators at Tate Britain from across the historical periods. And this was an exhibition really looking at the story of British art from the first part of the Tate collection in the 1600s to the present day, really. And it had over 150 works of art from different periods. So, for example, the early part of the exhibition reflected the early part of the Tate collection, which is almost all Flemish, Belgian, and Dutch artists, many of whom brought the genres of landscape and portraiture to British art. So before this period, portraiture and landscape were largely alien to British art in the way that it was the way we know it today. So that the collection of British art, for example, at Tate Britain, the early collection around portraiture and landscapes, are in fact mostly artists of migrant origin, and many of them were escaping Catholicism and war on the continent and came to Britain and brought their their painting languages to the UK. Ronald Moody in 1900, in the 1930s, was an important artist that came from Jamaica and made sculpture. He was very impressed by what he saw in the British Museum, particularly in the Egyptology department of the British Museum, and made works which were influenced by Caribbean folklore and African folklore, but also by Egyptian sculpture. And again, these works are now in the Tate collection.
That's a really important point, isn't it? I mean, the point about a long history of migration, if you like, which people
Absolutely.
often don't think about. And I suppose, a variety of inputs, and not just, again, a sort of, as people sometimes see things, a rather reductive focus on race or particular, forms of politics that are seen in one category. And I suppose as we enter a period, or we have entered a period of revived, identity politics and sort of culture wars of the sort that were partly present in the 80s as well. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that there are obviously, as there were then, Black artists. I'm thinking of the photographer Ronan Mackenzie with her I'm Home exhibition in 2018, which looked at 4 Black women, photographers who had very different perspectives, or Lynette Liardon Boache's, fictional figures who are in a way trying to draw attention to the notion that there isn't something straightforwardly, identitarian, if you like, about Blackness, and that taking you back to the power of the artistic medium itself as the starting point. I mean, I wonder how that plays through your focus on curation, and how one mediates the politics of that relationship.
So that's absolutely essential to my practice, Jane. One of the things that I worked on with Sonia Boyce at at University of the Arts London, Chelsea College of Arts, is a project called Black Artists and Modernism, where we wanted to focus actually on the works of art by Black and Asian artists themselves, because part of the, as you mentioned, the culture wars, many of the works of art produced by Black artists are often clouded or obscured by narratives of diversity, of race, of etc. And not much is talked about in terms of the actual work itself, what the artist was doing, how they were using the mediums, how they were innovating as artists. And so we kind of focused on wanting to place the works of art and how these artists were making these works at the center of attention. And that's kind of what my practice has done, has been doing for the past, 15, 20 years. And in fact, my latest exhibition, which opens at Kettle's Yard in Cambridge, University of Cambridge, in February next year, is called Untitled, Art on the Conditions of Our Time. And it will feature mostly Black artists, but it's called Untitled because it's about taking out the frame of race or diversity or Blackness and actually saying, well, what are these works actually saying? And when you do that, you find that these works are talking about race in many cases, or are talking about Blackness, but they're doing it in dialogue with sexuality, with politics, with economic questions, with questions of culture that actually reflect the dilemmas that all of us face, not just Black people. So what you said about putting the work first, and again, like I said earlier, I tend to take the cue of artists, what artists are doing. And it's, so for example, when you look at someone like Damien Hirst, or that's quite a dated example now, or Tracy Emin, or another famous white British artist, you don't often hear talk about them being white artists or having to explain themselves as white artists. Whereas Black artists often do have to explain themselves as Black artists, or why are they talking about race, or why, and when actually they're just doing work that that interests them. So Lunette Yidom Boashi, you mentioned, who paints figures from her imagination, and they're nearly all the color that nearly all Black figures. For her, those Black figures don't represent Black people. They're just figures from her imagination, people that she knows. And she says that it's important that Black people are allowed to be just people rather than Black people. So I agree with you, Jane. I think it's really important to place the work of art at the center, and that's kind of what guides my practice at the moment.
So what do you see? I mean, obviously recently you've actually returned to thinking more about the urban again, and perhaps you've never moved away from it, but in a way you've been more publicly engaged in thinking about the urban, and I suppose also different media. I mean, you've looked at music and soundscapes of the city, and I wonder whether that's also a response to the to the politics of the moment, and I suppose just to draw our conversation to a close. I mean, what do you see as the urgencies of the moment which art and your curatorial practice can really confront or needs to confront?
Well, I definitely want to be humble in the claims that how art can confront the urgencies of the moment. I believe it can, but I don't believe that art is a solution. I don't believe that art can. There's some people say art can change the world. We can kind of save the world if we were all artists. No, I don't think so. I mean, Hitler was an artist. Hitler actually, painted quite profusely, badly, but he was very much interested in art. And fascism, in fact, very much drew on aesthetics and art. People like Rennie Liefenstahl, the propaganda filmmaker, was a very brilliant filmmaker. So what I'm saying is that art is not innocent and it's not the solution. But I do believe that the sphere of art can encourage conversations. And I think it helps to open up conversations about difficult social issues in a way that perhaps, I think looking at the public sphere at the moment, particularly the urban public sphere, is very degraded. I think we've seen in both the UK and in Europe and in the States, the coarsening of public discourse and the simplification of narratives and the binarization of narratives. It's either you or us, it's us or them. And when you look at artwork, such as the one you're looking at here, But We Will Walk, which is an African-American artist, untrained artist, who made this beautiful sculpture. it opens up. Art uses a different language, and and the ambiguities of art, the ways that art transcends these kind of binary categories, and opens up questions of mystery, of affect, emotion, I think can really help us to at least have conversations and to think about some of the complex issues that we're facing today. So I would say that art has a role to play, but I wouldn't, as some of my colleagues might think that art can solve everything.
Thank you. I mean, it also, I suppose, to take a privilege of being a historian, I mean, I think it also opens up historical depth, doesn't it? Which again is so important in confronting the one dimensionality of presentism.
Absolutely, exactly. I couldn't agree more, Jane.
Great. Well, that's a really wonderful whistle-stop tour through various aspects of your career, and I think it's given lots of food for thought for the role of art in the present, and I'm sure lots of people will have questions, so I'll hand back to Ken.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Thanks, Jane. So you can either ask questions by putting them into the chat function. I think the hand function, when I click on my participants button tomorrow, I'm not getting any hand function, but maybe...
Because you're a host, so you can't...
Okay, so everyone else got a little hand, they can put up their hand, fine, okay. So if you have any questions, either type, well, I see someone putting up their hand in real time, William Wyndham. If people want to ask questions, it'd be useful if they could click on the little hand in the box when you press participants. But nevertheless, William, I can see you putting your hand up. So do you want to ask your question? But you'll have to unmute. No, you're still muted. No, you're muted.
Said unmute.
Can hear you now. Yeah, we can hear you now.
Oh, good. As a matter of fact, I was only trying to be helpful to show that I could put a hand up. But I did have a question, which I put to Salome Parker a while ago, and not to my surprise, she didn't return it, because it was something of a compendium question, which I find isn't totally irrelevant to the discourse. I didn't really know what the discourse was about from the wording of the initial question. I'm 80, and I was actually in the Paris banlieue in 1968 at the time of the Great Riots, which may cause our principal guest some amusement. But in any case, my question was, how can European culture benefit from sub-Saharan culture and is the migration necessitated by imminent climate change? And I'd add, obviously, an extra question: how can Wadham help with that if there is such a benefit?
Well, Paul.
Sure. Thank you, William. If I understand your question correctly, I would argue that there can be many benefits, and I would say that sub-Saharan African migration to Europe actually dates back many centuries, and the African presence in Europe, including in the UK and places like France as well, have been established in quite a few historical research texts and books that you can look up online. For example, there's a wonderful book called Staying Power by I've forgotten his name. Jane, can you help me? A historian. I've forgotten his name anyway, but there's a book called Staying Power: The History of Black Presence in Britain, which goes back to Roman times, to show that there's been a continuous Black presence, actually, African presence on British soil since the Roman times. So to go back to your question, William, I do think that in terms of more current migration and the current situation of migrants, yes, I think that there can be a very positive contribution that migrants can make. I think it's been shown generation after generation how migrants can contribute to the richness of the culture. Some of the artworks that I've just shown you and some of the artists I've shown you are artists, most of them are artists of migrant origin. Myself, my family came from Jamaica in the late 40s, 50s, the Windrush generation, and I'm now teaching. So just to say, William, that I agree with the thrust, if I understood it correctly, of the thrust of your question. And how can Wadham help? I think that would leave that one to Jane and to Ken.
Jane, what do you want to say? What do you want to say about that, Jane?
By connecting with people like Paul and having conversations, I think.
Exactly.
And educating wonderful students to go out into the world and actually, bring about change in lots of different areas. I think that's our role.
Encourage them to think about these things, but not just think, to do a bit more than think, I think.
Absolutely.
Is a key.
Yeah,
so engagement, we're very keen on engagement with the world. I think that's in this area speaks for its own value. George Trotter has said that Peter Fryer wrote
Peter Fryer, thank you, George.
Yeah.
Thank you, Peter Fryer, of course. Yeah.
Hawa Ibrahim asks, how do you situate your work within the Black Lives Matter movement?
That's a good question. Thank you, Hawa. I think it's a resource, and I've been told that by many students who have been protesting, both black and white students who've been protesting during the Black Lives Matter, and I've had many conversations who've said that the kind of work that I've been doing, they find useful to look at the fact that the struggle that they're going through now, in terms of racism, in terms of exclusion, in terms of making their voices heard, is not a new struggle. It's something that has been happening for a long time, and there's a history of that. And in fact, that artists have made work about that, in the UK. And some of that work is actually now national galleries now. So I would say that one way that I think I align my work with that is that I think it's an important teaching resource. There's an important intergenerational conversation happening now, that a lot of younger people who are involved in many of these struggles, perhaps more than myself and people my age, are really interested in that history. They're interested in the history of the Black president. We can see that, for example, with the recent films by Steve McQueen, a Chelsea College of Art graduate, who was recently in BBC, made these films called Small Acts. I'm not sure if anyone has seen those films, but there's been one on Lovers Rock that came out on Sunday, and one before on the Mangrove restaurant. Yeah,
it was brilliant.
Yeah, and these are really absolutely, Ken. And these are really important because they Steve McQueen is a Turner Prize winning, he's a visual artist as well as a filmmaker, Oscar winning director. Turner Prize winner. And the fact that he has made this really seminal series of films shows that these issues are now taken seriously, and that people are ready to listen to those messages. So to answer your question, I think I align my work with the work, and also in solidarity with the whole Black Lives Matter movement. And I think hopefully it will be a resource moving forward to consider these questions more.
Okay, other questions? I was interested in the question of change, Paul. So it was quite graphic the way you described going down to the bowels of the Tate and finding all this art. Actually, you can do the same in the Ashmolean. There's a bowels to the Ashmolean as well. But
I'd love to go.
But you found all these works by Black artists that were downstairs rather than upstairs. And do you see change in that? Is there change? Or is there a greater willingness on the part of the, for want of a better term, the art establishment, to be looking at this stuff and reassessing it?
Exactly, Ken. My answer to that is yes and no, right? So, for example, I met the artist Rashid Arain, who's a Pakistani British artist. He's like the doyen of Black British art. And he's founded the journal Third Text. It's a really important journal. It's very important. He was one of the founders of British minimal art and minimal sculpture. And he was the one, because I was working with Third Text when I first started at Tate, and he told me, Paul, go to the Tate stores and you'll see my work there in the Tate stores, and they've never shown it. And I think, come on, Rashid, are you serious? He said, yeah, go and look and you'll see other artists. And I did, and he was right. I saw his work and it wasn't shown. Now, also, I have to say, there were many, many white artists that, for example, Ellis Lowry, his work hardly ever shown. I saw loads of Lowrys in the basement, and wondered why is it never really shown in Britain? And so there's lots of. So I'm not saying that race is the only reason why artworks are not shown. Gender as well. There were plenty of female artists that were in the basement that are not being shown. So I think, Ken, it's really about what I try to do in my work is to try and demystify the process of curation in some respects, because it's been, people don't really know what it means or what it is or how curators work or how those decisions are made. So I've tried to kind of like discuss that a little bit in some of my writing and some of my work. But in terms of change, there has been some change, Ken. So Rashid's work, for example, has been shown quite a lot now, and including at Tate, but he's now shown very much in the Far East. I mean, and he's got a big market in those places after many, many years of being ignored and excluded. The same with some of my colleagues, Sonia and other artists who are now getting shown and getting retrospectives. But the change is slow and the change is definitely not enough. And there are still, for example, since I've left Tate, I believe that, and I was the only curator of color or black curator in the curatorial department. I believe there may be one or two now. So that's not a huge change. So what I'm saying is, I think there has been some change, and that's part of that is external because of Black Lives Matter, because of increasing activism, because artists are saying we want change, white and black artists. And that has kind of forced museums to, as you see, most museums are talking about decolonizing the collection or decolonizing this, decolonizing that. And my worry about that, Ken, is that the discourse of decolonization becomes co-opted by the museums as another form of diversity, a kind of watered down sort of surface change without really changing the structures of power. Who does the curating? Who's on the management? Who's on the board of the museums? Because often those situations haven't changed at all. So
we're back to Stuart Hall's monsters of assimilation, aren't you?
Monsters of assimilation. Yeah. So I guess, Ken, it's a mixed bag. I am hopeful. I think there are things happening. I've seen young curators coming out now who are doing really interesting stuff, and young artists who are getting more recognition. But the pace of change needs to increase.
Okay, Anki.
Paul, that was very inspiring. I so enjoyed your talk. What I have to say is not so much a question as it is a comment, and I found it very inspiring the way in which you brought together artists of African and Asian origin. That you're in a way, yes, your definition of black was very excursive and expansive. Yes. And as somebody who is Indian, I always sort of like, yes, feel a little nervous about sort of very quickly putting on the black mantle, because I think the anti-black racism is so virulent that you don't want to kind of, in a way, you want to be very careful about sort of, in a way, minding your own privilege when you are kind of co-opted under the sort of black umbrella. But I mean, it would be very interesting for you for me to hear. I've seen this in sort of figures in higher education. The person who comes to mind first is someone called Ayala Solanki, an EU law professor at Leeds, who did extremely powerful work for the Runnymede Foundation, and where she sort of counted the number of black women professors, myself included, and it turned out to be 2% in the professoriate. But then even there, in that 2%, a large number were from the subcontinent, and large number were East Asian, so they were not sort of Afro-Caribbean. So it would be very interesting for me to hear what are the limits of this alliance, if we are to call it sort of, a sort of black art, and of course, what are the privileges? I mean, I obviously want to see the positive sides more, but as someone who's Indian, I feel a bit nervous about, kind of calling myself black because of the very reasons I mentioned.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's a really great comment and really important question. I think a lot of the works that I showed were from a generation of Black British art where the question of blackness was a political definition of blackness. It wasn't seen. I mean, there were debates. Let me not mischaracterize it. There were debates within the community. Some people said, black art is about people of African descent. Others said that Asians couldn't be part. But then, but the majority of artists that I worked with, absolutely, there was a notion that blackness was defined by exclusion from the mainstream and from racism. And there was a kind of a historic pact, so that people like, for example, Rashid Alim is absolutely probably the most important artist in Britain when it comes to thinking about Black art. And many of the artists that I work with will tell you that. And that, as you said, that alliance produced, you know, some amazing works of art. And many of those artists are now in very senior positions. But you know, things have changed. And that reflected at the time, in the 70s and 80s, a kind of political alliance between non-white communities, which, as Stephen Andon talks about, who was an amazing Sri Lankan theorist and director of the Institute of Race Relations, as he talked about that, you know, there were tactics of division that came in by the state and by local authorities, particularly through funding regimes, to split communities into ethnic groups and kind of move away from this division. And I think he was quite right, that happened to a certain extent. So that now I don't think there is a consensus in the same way there was then about what a Black artist is. And but there are new definitions that are emerging from artists around, for example, terms such as people of color, POC, often articulated with notions of sexuality and sexual identity. So queer, trans identities are composite identities that include many different communities. And that exists alongside more essentialist ideas of identity. So a lot of the work that I've been interested in has been around these kind of political definitions of Blackness, Anki. And I think that they do exist, but for a lot of younger artists, they're in a different world now. And identity is much more complex and much more fragmented in some respects. And there were positives to that, but there were also traps that I think we need to avoid.
Mm. George Trotter.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Sure.
Fab. Thank you very much for this event. It's been fantastic so far. I was just interested in a couple of your most recent answers, Paul. The word co-opt has come up a couple of times, and I've read in interviews as well that you've been asked questions and you've reflected on sort of being curtailed or sort of somewhat boxed in by maybe I don't want to put words into your mouth, but by institutions. And I'm curious, navigating the institutions that you've navigated, how we avoid, because I'm aware of that now. It's my first sort of year in Oxford, and I'm very much aware of the fact that these spaces can become they can sometimes stifle expression if you're not careful. I'm just curious about how you've managed to avoid that, if you feel you've managed to avoid that.
Yeah, thank you, George. It's a really important, and it's been a theme, I think, that as I was talking with Jane about this, and Jane mentioned it, you know, it's something that I've felt, you know, from Oxford through to Tate, through to, you know, various other institutions that I've been involved in. And I've tried to cultivate, this posture of recalcitrance that I mentioned, right? This sense of being in, but not of an institution, you know, because I think it can be very dangerous for marginalized groups who are part of these institutions to totally over-identify with them, because the history of those institutions, we need to be aware of the history of those institutions, including a university such as Oxford, a great university, and I benefited greatly from studying at this university. But nevertheless, it is absolutely true that these institutions, such as Oxford, have been the foundations of much of the colonial histories to which my ancestors and my family have been subjected. So I'm acutely aware of that. And part of my research and teaching is about bringing out those contradictions and making them clear. The other point to your question, I think I'm very influenced by a text called The Undercommons by Fred Moten and Stefano Hani, and I've done a lot of work and some writing around that, and thinking about how because the idea that you can be completely free or completely outside of the institution and critique from the outside, that's gone. I mean, that's not possible anymore, right? If it was ever possible. So the question is, how do you do that within the institution? Well, partly about trying to use the resources of the institution and to repurpose them and to be part of a more equitable distribution of those resources through various ways, for encouraging students, for working with groups outside the university or outside the institution that are working for social justice and social change, and to identify with that, and also to bring those issues into the curriculum. So in my work, for example, at UAL, at Chelsea, I bring those issues absolutely into the curriculum. I bring speakers into the university. So just trying to make those borders more porous, not to make them so hard and fast. I'm in the institution, I'm not really interested in what's outside because I want to benefit from the prestige of the institution. There's ways that you can use or detourn the prestige of the institution for other purposes that it perhaps wasn't even intended to. So it's an ongoing project, George, and it's something which I think I'm sure you'll find your own way of doing that. Yeah.
Thank you. Catherine Mackenzie asks, could you say a bit about diversifying the audience for art, please? And how can we avoid a tick box approach to diversification when it comes to audience and outreach? So presumably you're one of the things, your exhibitions presumably are bringing people into Tate and the other galleries that you work in that wouldn't otherwise be coming or haven't come before.
Yeah, but it's really hard, Ken. And I can't, I mean, I would be lying if I told you that the exhibitions I've worked on have brought in masses of new audiences. Often, many of the people that come to my exhibitions are white middle class or black middle class people. And so I've never subscribed to the fact that you must only work in these great institutions. I also do projects outside of these institutions. I've worked in the banlieue. I've worked in, for example, the barrios in Lisbon. I've done exhibitions in mental hospitals. I've done exhibitions in community spaces or online, right? So I think the work that I've been doing at Tate and the big institutions, is canonical work. Is trying to open up the canon, as I said in my thing, moving beyond the canon, try to reshape the canon in some ways, and to extend what the canon means, and to have a debate about what is canonical, and that's important. But that's not the only way that we can make those interventions. And in terms of the audience is a really difficult issue, because, for example, a museum like Tate Britain, for example, has the oldest audience profile of any museum in the country. Now that has been changed by some of the programming that I've also contributed to. So, for example, Late at Tate is an after hours event with live music and performance alongside art that has really helped to bring in different audiences. And in fact, the one that I curated for Chris Ofili's show in 2010 brought in an indoor audience of 10,000 people, which today is still the record for the number of people that came into a Tate exhibition or Tate event. But it's not easy to maintain that, and I think we have to be honest about that. So there's lots of work to be done again, Ken. I don't have an easy solution, and I think, but the idea is that we should be mindful of the audiences that we're working with, and to try and reach out to as many different constituencies as possible. But I don't necessarily think that everyone has to come to an art gallery. I come from a very working class background in London, and I was lucky enough to be shown, to be sort of coaxed into a gallery and then realizing this is what I wanted to do. But I also recognize that not everyone wants to do it. Some people want to watch, football. I do as well, or watch the X Factor, and that's fine too. I would love that everyone comes to see art, but not everyone will do. And I've kind of reconciled I don't try to convert everyone into going into an art gallery, even though I think everyone should.
Well, there's a glorious statistic, I don't know if it's true, but I've seen it bandied around often, that more people visit art galleries on a Saturday in the UK than attend football matches. It's the kind of statistic you want to be true, but It sounds like you're dubious about that one. I've seen it.
I'm not sure about that one. Yeah, I think okay. I take it. I take it on.
Oh, if you look at Tate Modern, tens of thousands of people.
Yeah, no, you're right. But you're right, Ken.
Derek Cannon raises an interesting question. He talks about the art network that he's involved with, having discussed this recently and come to the conclusion that it's not enough to be racist. It's not enough simply not to be racist. You have to be positively anti-racist. And I'm wondering what your observation about this. What is it for an art gallery to be anti-racist as opposed to simply not racist?
It's a good question. I was actually, funny enough, last week in a debate with the National Museum of World Cultures in Amsterdam, but of course by Zoom, about this very question. It was a debate about the possibility of anti-racist curating. What does that mean? And I have to say that I was quite skeptical. Not that curating can, or exhibitions can contribute to anti-racism, but again, I think we have to be humble about that. You know, the sphere of culture, and particularly the sphere of culture in mainstream institutions, there's a limit to what it actually can achieve because of the actual constitution of those institutions. In other words, for a truly anti-racist museum, or for a big museum, national museum, to become an anti-racist institution, it would probably mean, as Fanon said, total disorder. You'd have to totally reconstruct the museum and its foundations and collections and restructure it in a completely different way in order for it to be truly anti-racist. That's what I think.
Back to Marinetti blowing up the museums.
This is probably my my anarchist streak, but I think that's what true decolonization is, not the decolonization that currently museums are rushing to adopt, which is to have a few black artists, or a few programs, education programs, and then say we're decolonized. No, decolonization is total disorder, to use the words of Frantz Fanon, who I think is probably the most important writer on decolonization.
That's really interesting. That is interesting. I think we've reached the time when we have to finish. It's been a real pleasure and a fascinating discussion, Paul. And I'm sure everyone has taken a great deal from it. So I'd like to thank you and Jane for your conversation. I'd like to thank everyone for attending. Please look out for further events in this series. We're going to be doing a few of them. And I'm quite sure that when the pandemic is over, we'll continue to do online events because it's a very good way to reach people who find coming to Oxford inconvenient. And we get quite an international audience at these events. But Paul, I want to simply to conclude by saying it's a real honour for the college to have you as an honorary fellow. And thank you very much for this evening.
Thank you, Paul.
And thank you. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Ken. And thank you for everyone at Wadham.